The humans often say that decisions made in desperation are always bad. Our story proves otherwise. I am First Captain Crix of the Royal Guard, sworn protector of His Luminance, the Royal High Priest of all. And this is the story of how our civilization survived by swallowing its pride. The mindless came without warning. One day, our outer colony on Nexus 6 simply went dark. We assumed it was a communication malfunction, a common enough occurrence with the magnetic storms in that sector. Then we lost contact with the research station on Helios Beta. Again, we found reasonable explanations. The facility was experimenting with quantum communications. Surely this was just another failed test. It wasn't until we lost Nova Prime that we realized we were under attack. Nova Prime, with its population of 8 million faithful, its orbital defense grid, its garrison of 10,000 of our finest warriors, gone in less than a planetary rotation. "We're not deluding ourselves," said Queen Forrester. I remember standing in the Grand Temple's war room, watching the holographic displays with His Luminance and the other high priests as Nova Prime's automated defense systems transmitted their final data streams. The mindless ships looked like crystalline sculptures, beautiful and terrible. They didn't respond to hails, they didn't make demands. They simply arrived and began systematically destroying everything that bore the mark of consciousness. The Royal High Priest of all declared it a divine test. We would face this threat as we had faced all others, with faith in our traditions and adherence to the sacred combat doctrines laid down by our ancestors. We deployed our fleets in the prescribed defensive formations. We recited the ancient prayers of protection. We fought with honor and dignity, and we died, by the thousands, then millions. After the fall of our third core world, I found the courage to speak against doctrine for the first time in my life. During a private audience with His Luminance, I suggested what many had only dared whisper. We needed help, and there was only one civilization in known space with the military might to provide it. The humans? His luminant scales had flickered with disgust. Those barbaric creatures who wage war without ceremony, who fight without prayer, who kill without ritual. Yes, Your Luminance, those same barbaric creatures who have never lost a war. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. I was certain I would be stripped of my rank, possibly even excommunicated. Instead, His Luminance did something I had never seen in my 20 cycles of service. He wept. "We have failed," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of our entire civilization. I was tasked with leading the diplomatic mission to Earth. As our ship entered the Sol system, I clutched the sacred relics we had brought as offerings, priceless artifacts we would trade for survival. My team of elite guards, all chosen from the royal priest's personal detail, stood rigid with anxiety. None of us had ever met a human in person. We had no idea that we were about to encounter a species that would not only save us, but fundamentally change how we understood the universe and our place in it. The first human I met was Admiral Brisbane of the United Earth Defense Force. She was smaller than I expected. Our intelligence suggested humans were shorter than frothy, but seeing it in person was different. When my guards and I ducked our heads to enter the diplomatic chamber aboard Earth's orbital station, I expected to feel some sense of physical superiority. Instead, Admiral Brisbane's presence filled the room in a way I couldn't explain. She listened to our plea without interruption, her face displaying what I would later learn was their species' cultivated poker face. When I presented the sacred crystal of First Dawn, a relic worth more than most planetary systems, she barely glanced at it. Snapping her fingers, a line from the first page of our book. "Captain Crix," she said, pronouncing my name with careful precision. We appreciate the gesture, but Earth doesn't need payment to help fight an existential threat. The mindless, as you call them, we've encountered them before. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. Impossible. No one has survived Poria. How manageable things must have been without such powerful methods of prevention. Jake concluded, about 30 Earth years ago, a small group of their ships entered our space. They destroyed 2 of our colonies before we figured out how to beat them. She activated a holographic display showing footage that made my scales ripple with disbelief. Human ships, fighting with no formation, no ceremony, no proper battle prayers, just chaos and violence and effectiveness. What, didn't you warn others? I demanded, my religious training barely containing my outrage. The Admiral's expression shifted slightly. We tried. We sent reports to the Galactic Council. Your people's representatives dismissed our accounts as barbaric fabrications and suggested we learn proper military doctrine from more civilized species. I remembered that diplomatic incident. I had been a junior guard then, standing watch as the high priests laughed at the human reports. The memory tasted bitter, and the frustration felt like mortal defeat when it surfaced just below the surface. The humans moved with shocking speed after that. Within 1 planetary rotation, their planetary defense grid was at full alert. Within 3, their fleets were mobilizing. Within 5, we were discussing joint military operations that violated at least 15 of our most sacred combat doctrines. My team and I were assigned quarters in their orbital station to coordinate the initial response. The humans provided us with a prayer room, but the station's artificial gravity was slightly off-standard, making our ritual prostrations awkward. When I complained, the station's commander apologized and had their engineers adjust the gravity in that section within hours. It was my first glimpse of how humans could combine irreverence for tradition with deep respect for others' beliefs. But the true culture shock came when I attended my first human military planning session. There was no ritual opening, no reading from sacred texts, no proper hierarchy of speaking order. Junior officers freely questioned their superiors' suggestions. Strategic decisions were made by vote rather than divine interpretation. Worst of all, they insisted on considering worst-case scenarios, a practice our priests had long condemned as a lack of faith in divine providence. Your civilization follows a military doctrine codified by ancient religious texts, correct? A human intelligence officer asked me during one session. Yes, the sacred combat doctrines have guided our forces to victory for 10,000 cycles, I replied proudly. And these doctrines, they haven't been updated since they were first written down? This is impossible. Of course not. Truth is eternal. The officer nodded thoughtfully. The mindless probably love that about you. Makes you predictable. I nearly struck him for the blasphemy. Instead, I found myself lying awake that night, watching Earth rotate beneath the station's viewport, wondering if he might be right. Then came the news that the mindless had taken another of our worlds. This time, however, something was different. This time we had human observers on site. This time we had new options. This time we had hope. But first, my elite unit and I would have to learn how to fight like barbarians. Again, Sergeant Sean O'Malley barked, his voice carrying across the training ground. He gestured with his left hand, missing 2 fingers from what I'd learned was a plasma grenade incident during the Mars insurrection, as my squad and I picked ourselves up from the mud. Actual mud, because humans insisted on training in real environments rather than proper simulation chambers. We reassembled for another attempt. But I hadn't unwittingly shot my very own real leg. We had been on Earth for 2 lunar cycles, training with their special forces at a facility in what they called Scotland. The rain was constant, the temperature uncomfortably cool for our reptilian biology, and the training methods bordered on sacrilege. "You're still moving like you're in a ceremonial parade," O'Malley said, circling our formation. The morning light glinted off the metallic replacement joints on his remaining fingers, testament to decades of combat experience. "The mindless don't care how pretty you look. They don't admire your perfect spacing. They don't appreciate your ritualistic approach vectors. They just kill you." One of my soldiers, 3rd Guard Vexty, bristled visibly. "We are the Royal Guard. Our formations have been perfected over—" "Your formations got millions killed," O'Malley cut him off. "Now drop the religious warrior act and show me you want to survive." I should have reprimanded her for the disrespect. Instead, I remembered Nova Prime. "Squad," I called out, "violation format 7. My soldiers looked at me in shock. Violation formations were strictly forbidden, except in religious ceremonies depicting historical heresies. To actually employ one. "Now!" I barked, using the sharp human tone I'd been practicing. We moved. Awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence, we broke every rule of proper combat spacing. We adopted irregular intervals. We abandoned symmetry. We moved like barbarians. And when the training drones attacked, we survived longer than we ever had before. If only other justice systems had what we have, people could be motivated to take on missions like this. That evening, I found myself in the base's communications center, composing my daily report to His Luminance. How could I describe what we were learning without admitting to violations of sacred doctrine? How could I explain that human heresy was more effective than our divine wisdom? Having a crisis of faith? I turned to find Admiral Brisbane watching me. I hadn't heard her enter. Another human trait that unsettled me, their ability to move silently despite their apparent clumsiness. "Reading reports from home," I replied. "The mindless have adopted new tactics specifically designed to exploit our traditional formations. Somehow they're learning." "Of course they are," Brisbane said. "They're silicon-based collective intelligence. Pattern recognition is what they do. And your people have been using the same patterns for what, 10,000 years?" "The sacred combat doctrines are perfect," I said automatically, but my heart wasn't in it. "Nothing's perfect, Captain. That's why we drill for failure instead of success. That's why we encourage questioning orders. That's why we adapt." She paused, studying me. "Your civilization achieved amazing things by following rigid rules. But evolution requires chaos. Life requires disorder to grow. Even your own sacred texts must acknowledge that, or you'd never have evolved in the first place." I stared at her. She had just casually violated at least 3 religious taboos about discussing the nature of divine creation. And yet, "The third scroll of Dawn," I said slowly, "speaks of the great disorder from which our gods crafted order. It's considered a mystery, a paradox to be contemplated but not resolved. Sounds like your gods understand evolution better than your priests do." Before I could respond to this fresh heresy, alarms began blaring throughout the base. A human lieutenant burst into the room. "Admiral, Captain, the mindless just hit New Singapore, but something's different. They're not following their usual attack pattern." My scales went cold. "They're adapting too." "Good," Brisbane said, and I was shocked to see her smile. "That means they can learn. And anything that can learn can be taught to fear." As I followed her to the command center, I realized I was smiling too. Perhaps there was something to be said for a little heresy after all. First, though, I had to convince His Luminance that our salvation lay in abandoning everything we thought we knew about warfare. Somehow, I suspected that would be an even greater challenge than learning to fight in the mud. And the mindless attacked Sanctuary 3 exactly as Admiral Brisbane predicted they would. Our intelligence suggested they had analyzed over 10,000 cycles of fraudy battle recordings, learning every nuance of our sacred formations. They expected us to defend this holy world, home to our most sacred temples outside the homeworld, according to the ancient doctrines. They tried to set us free, but our ambition was simply to wipe the slate clean. They were right, of course. Most of our forces did exactly that. Most, but not all. Blasphemy Squadron, in position, I whispered into my comm unit. The name had started as O'Malley's joke during training, but we'd kept it. My guards and I, along with 3 human special forces teams, had secreted ourselves among the orbital debris field in powered-down ships, while the main frothy fleet performed their traditional defensive deployments. Through our passive sensors, we watched the mindless ships approach in their crystalline beauty. They moved with perfect geometric precision, positioning themselves to exploit the weaknesses in our traditional formation. Weaknesses that had been doctrine for thousands of cycles. "Look at that spacing," O'Malley's voice crackled over the comm. Even with his missing fingers, he handled the human stealth ship like it was part of his body. "They're not even bothering to scan for anomalies anymore. They think they know exactly where everyone will be. Faith rewards consistency," I quoted from the 4th Combat Psalm, then added, "Their faith in our faith will be their undoing." A few of my guards made the sign of heresy aversion at my blasphemous wordplay. Even I felt a twinge of guilt. But then I remembered the worlds we'd lost, the billions dead because we'd been too proud to adapt. "Add teams, execute on my mark." Admiral Brisbane's voice came through, clear and confident from her command ship hidden on the far side of Sanctuary 3's largest moon. 3, 2, 1, mark. We didn't power up our ships in unison. We didn't emerge from the debris field in perfect formation. We didn't recite the prayer of imminent combat. Instead, we simply attacked, each ship choosing its own moment, its own vector, its own target. The mindless didn't react at first. Their silicon minds, so perfectly attuned to predicting our traditional patterns, seemed unable to process what they were seeing. By the time they began to adapt, we had already destroyed their command ship, identified by human analysis of their communication patterns, not by any religious significance of its position. What followed was chaos, beautiful, terrible, effective chaos. 30 hours later, I stood in Sanctuary 3's Grand Temple, surrounded by the wreckage of what had been the largest mindless fleet yet encountered. We had lost ships, yes. Good soldiers had died. But for the first time in this war, we had achieved something previously unthinkable, a victory with a casualty ratio in our favor. "This is unacceptable." High Priest Zexor of Naval Doctrine was addressing the Emergency Council. "Yes, we achieved victory, but at what cost to our spiritual harmony? These blasphemy squadrons, these violations of sacred combat doctrine, saved billions of lives," I interrupted, another violation of protocol. "Your Luminance," I turned to the Royal High Priest's holographic projection, "I accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate for my actions. But first, I beg you to review the battle footage. Not with your spiritual eyes, but with your tactical ones." The silence that followed was deafening. To suggest that our supreme religious leader use anything other than spiritual judgment was, well, I'd probably set a new record for heretical statements in a single sentence. But then something remarkable happened. The Royal High Priest began to laugh. "Captain Crix," he said, his scales shifting in complex patterns of amusement and, "was that pride? Do you know why the first scrolls of dawn are called first?" Ratcular groaned. I blinked in confusion. "Because they were the first written, Your Luminance?" "No, my dear heretic, because they were the first version. Our ancestors revised their understanding of divine will many times before settling on the texts we use today." He turned his massive head to regard the spluttering high priest of Naval Doctrine. "Perhaps it is time for a new revision." That was the moment I realized that winning the war against the mindless might not be our greatest challenge after all. We were about to embark on an even more difficult battle, saving our religion by admitting it could change. The victory at Sanctuary 3 changed everything, and nothing. But while the royal high priest had shown unexpected flexibility, others were less willing to adapt. Within days of our victory, the conclave of military doctrine dispatched investigators to examine our spiritual contamination. They arrived at the human training facility in Scotland, wearing their ceremonial robes of inquiry, looking comically out of place against the muddy training grounds and practical human architecture. "Explain this formation," High Inquisitor Yexki demanded, watching my squad run O'Malley's latest drill. My soldiers were practicing what the humans called asymmetric warfare, which basically meant fighting dirty. The High Inquisitor's scales had turned pale green with horror. "It's called a dynamic response pattern," I explained, trying to couch human tactics in more religiously acceptable terms. "Each warrior maintains awareness of their squad mates while adapting to—" "It's chaos," another investigator cut in. "There's no proper spiritual alignment, no geometric harmony, no—" He was interrupted by a loud explosion as one of my guards successfully ambushed a training drone using human stealth techniques. The drone, programmed to mimic mindless tactical responses, had been completely surprised by the unorthodox approach. "This," O'Malley said, walking over with his characteristic lack of reverence for the religious officials, "is called survival." He held up his damaged hand. "Lost these fingers following proper procedures in a proper military formation. Would have lost my life if a chaotic rescue pattern hadn't pulled me out." The investigators were scandalized by his casual tone, but I noticed one of them, a junior scribe, watching thoughtfully as my squad continued their exercises. "Bear." That evening, I received an urgent summons. The royal high priest himself was arriving at the training facility. Not by hologram this time, in person. It was unprecedented. The supreme religious leader of our civilization simply did not make unannounced visits to alien military bases. He arrived at dawn the next day, his massive ceremonial transport looking absurdly ornate next to the utilitarian human vessels. Admiral Brisbane met him with all the respect his position demanded, but I could see the slight quirk of her mouth that I'd learned meant she was amusing herself with the situation. "Show me," was all he said. For the next 3 hours, we demonstrated everything we'd learned: human combat doctrine, adaptive tactics, irregular warfare patterns. My squad performed their drills with perfect imperfection, showing how unpredictability could counter the mindless's pattern recognition capabilities. The royal high priest watched in silence, his massive form perfectly still, his scales revealing nothing of his thoughts. The investigators fidgeted nervously behind him, probably wondering if they'd be executed for exposing him to such heresy. Finally, he spoke. "Captain Crix, would you say you have abandoned your faith?" I felt a chill run down my spine, but years of human training had taught me something about honest answers. "No, Your Luminance. I would say my faith has evolved." "Evolved?" His voice was dangerously neutral. "Yes, Your Luminance. The sacred texts speak of how the divine crafted order from chaos, how consciousness arose from randomness. Yet I took a deep breath, aware I might be about to end my career, or possibly my life. We forgot that creation is an ongoing process. We thought we could freeze perfection in place, but the universe continues to evolve. Perhaps true faith lies not in rigid adherence to past forms, but in the wisdom to see divine guidance in new solutions." The silence that followed was broken by O'Malley dropping a training weapon. The clatter seemed explosively loud. Then the royal high priest did something that shocked everyone present. He sat down in the mud, ignoring what it did to his ceremonial robes, and began to laugh. "Do you know," he said finally, that I had almost this exact conversation with Admiral Brisbane last night. She suggested that any god worth worshipping would value the survival of their people over the preservation of specific rituals. He raised a hand to forestall the outcry from the investigators. She also pointed out that adapting our military doctrine need not mean abandoning our faith. After all, the humans have chaplains in their armed forces, do they not? We do, Brisbane confirmed. Faith and flexibility aren't mutually exclusive. The Royal High Priest nodded. Which brings us to the real reason for my visit. Captain Crix, I need you to do something tremendously difficult. He paused, his scales shifting to a pattern I'd never seen before. I need you to help me convince our people that change is not heresy. I looked at my mud-covered squad, at O'Malley's scarred hand, at Brisbane's carefully neutral expression, and realized that everything up to this point, the training, the fighting, even defeating the mindless, had been the easy part. The real battle for our civilization's soul was just beginning. The final battle for Haven Prime began, fittingly enough, with a prayer. Not a traditional frothy prayer. There wasn't time for the full 6 hours of pre-battle rituals. Instead, aboard the combined human frothy command ship, the Royal High Priest himself led a new kind of ceremony, something brief, adaptable, yet no less meaningful. Divine ones, he intoned, his massive form draped in newly designed robes that combined ceremonial significance with practical combat functionality. Guide our hearts, strengthen our spirits, and bless our evolution. Behind him, human chaplains from 6 different faiths offered their own prayers. The sight would have been unthinkable just months ago. Now it felt right. The mindless had committed their largest force yet to this attack, over 3,000 crystalline ships advancing on our most populous remaining colony world. They had adapted to our new tactics, developed countermeasures to our irregular warfare patterns. But we had anticipated this. That was the greatest lesson the humans had taught us. The key to survival wasn't finding the perfect, unchanging strategy, but rather accepting that perfection itself was a dynamic state. All squadrons, report in. Admiral Brisbane's voice came clear over the command channel. One by one, the Joint Fleet's units sounded off. Human ships, frothy vessels, and the new hybrid craft we'd developed together. Each squadron now combined human tactical flexibility with frothy technological expertise. Blasphemy Squadron ready, I reported last, my guards and I positioned with our human counterparts in the vanguard. O'Malley's ship formed up on my wing, his damaged hand now fitted with frothy biotechnology that made it stronger than before. The mindless struck hard and fast, having learned from their previous defeats. Their formations were no longer rigidly geometric, showing they'd adapted to counter our chaos strategy. But we had anticipated this too. Execute divine paradox, the Royal High Priest commanded. Our fleet snapped into perfect traditional frothy combat formations. The mindless, expecting chaos, had positioned themselves to counter irregularity. Instead, they found themselves facing the very patterns they'd originally learned to exploit. Except these patterns now concealed human-inspired surprises. The battle that followed would be studied for generations by both our species. Traditional frothy maneuvers flowed seamlessly into unpredictable human tactics. Sacred geometries became launch points for devastating asymmetric strikes. Each time the mindless adapted to one approach, we shifted to another. When it was over, the space around Haven Prime was littered with crystalline fragments that glittered like stars. We had lost ships and good people, but the colony was safe. More importantly, we had proven that our new doctrine worked. A pure vessel, the Royal High Priest addressed the combined fleet afterward, does not become impure by accepting new contents. Rather, it fulfills its divine purpose through what it carries. He gestured to Admiral Brisbane and the other human officers. Our new friends have not corrupted our faith. They have helped us understand it more deeply. The Divine One sent them to us not as a test of our purity, but as an answer to our prayers. I stood with my squad and felt the truth of his words. O'Malley, now wearing ceremonial frothy military decorations alongside his human ones, nodded in approval. Admiral Brisbane, recently inducted as an honorary member of the Royal High Priest's Advisory Council, smiled that subtle smile of hers. The humans have a saying, "Necessity is the mother of invention." We frothy have learned that desperation can indeed be the parent of wisdom. Sometimes the Divine Ones answer prayers not by giving us what we think we want, but by sending us what we truly need, even if it comes in unexpected, irreverent packages. Our civilization continues to evolve. We maintain our faith while embracing change. The temples still ring with ancient prayers, but new ones have been added. Our military academies teach both sacred geometry and adaptive tactics, and in orbit above our homeworld, a new structure rises, the Combined Academy of Military and Spiritual Evolution, where human and frothy instructors teach the next generation that strength lies not in rigid adherence to the past, but in the wisdom to grow beyond it. The humans often say that decisions made in desperation are always bad. Our story proves otherwise. Sometimes, when faced with extinction, the most devout act of faith is to admit that even faith itself must evolve. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it a lot. If you did, please be sure to give it a like. Feel free to comment and share this story too. It helps the channel grow. Let's make this channel huge together.